Our series, Show and Tell, will take you inside some of the great libraries, both public and private, to explore books and treasures from Jewish history. We're now joined both by Dr. David Kraemer and Sharon Mintz, who really are at the center of this amazing library and all these treasures. And there's so much history here. The library was founded what year?
In 1886.
In 1886. And then
it grew over the course of the next half century and amassed numerous important collections, including the Curator. And in 1966, tragedy struck the library. The library was housed in a tall tower right where you walk into the building, and the fire there consumed some of the books, but the actual problem was that they threw water down from the top of this building because there were no windows on the side. Now there are windows. If you come to JTS, you'll see them, but it had what was known as a blind facade. So the only way to put the fire out was to take water from the top. And as the water filtered down through the floors, and the floors were open grates in order to promote air circulation, which was the way you built things in 1929, it damaged the books.
Old libraries were designed.
Yes, many old libraries were designed that way.
Go from stack to stack, but it was wide open.
Wide open. At that point, what they decided to do was they needed to bring in volunteers to help dry the books. And they brought up all the paper towels in the tri-state area, kind of literally. And they had hundreds of volunteers who came down and actually interleaved the books. They would put paper towels in between each page and press it tight, and then take it out and do it again until the book was dry. And we know that volunteers came from the yeshivot, from Yeshiva University, from the universities, who literally closed their classes in April of 1966 to bring in the manpower and help save the cultural patrimony of the Jewish people.
And where were all these books drying off?
So it was in a courtyard. JTS was built as many academic institutions with 3 buildings around a large courtyard, and they put it out there, and you can see people with the books open, kind of trying to dry it out, and it actually saved the books. Since that time, they now know that you can freeze dry books. They do this when they're ever flooded, and that sucks out the moisture in a more effective, faster way, but that hadn't been discovered just yet.
My wife's going to kill me when I start leaving books in our freezer. That's the next
It's not that kind of freeze drying.
She's going to open up the fridge. Open up the fridge. It's going to be just books.
It's very important to emphasize that this entire story relates not to our rare collection, which is what we've been discussing and showing, but to our general collection. Right? So the tower was the stacks of our general
rare treasures.
The rare treasures, the rare book room of that time was not in the tower. It was in a different section of JTS. And what that means is that as tragic as this was, and it was, and to be fair, there are materials that were in the stacks in those days that we would long since have considered to be rare, but our actual rare book room and the materials, many of which you see around us, or which we've been showing you, were in a different location. And so, thank God, while this affected that general collection, and there were many very important things in that collection, some of them irreplaceable because they're prints that had been made and were no longer available. Nevertheless, this did not affect our rare collections.
One thing that's amazing about JTS is that the library preserves the history in these really charming sign-in books. This is titled over here, the Mortimer and Harriet Marcus Rare Bookroom Visitors Book. So you can really see the history is told of who came to visit, and you actually have the documents of like who came to dry the books. Exactly. And they were coming in, and they were all out in that lobby kind of soaking and making sure that they would dry up and be preserved. Is there a particular book you know that was lost, or that is no longer part of the collection, that couldn't be saved, that you still think about?
Well, the great father of bibliography, Steinschneider's collection, was in the general stacks, and his own personal annotated collection was most primarily lost to the fire. The Benayim manuscript collection was being processed. So this was books that were being processed were in this area as well. So there are things. that we know were lost. There's
or that were affected and damaged.
Yeah, water damage.
But it's a moving story about New York Jewry coming
Exactly,
together to save our collective history.
I mean,
and ideas.
there were unhappy accidents. The last collection that Sharon just mentioned had been recently retrieved from North Africa by our librarian of the time, Menachem Schmelzer.
He traveled
to gather that collection, and it had not yet been processed. And so it was caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Having said that, the library building before this one had a huge high-density storage room. And in that room, amongst other things, were thousands, right? I think that's fair to say, right? Tens of thousands of materials that survived the fire and sat there for decades. And we struggled, but ultimately succeeded to raise money to process a lot of that collection. And we have recovered books, and some of them, which, again, before the fire were not yet deemed to be rare, we now recognize their rarity, and they've been added to our rare collections since. In the period of time of just the last few years, our collection of rare printed books has gone from about 25,000 to about 32,000. Well, much of that recovering from those materials.
Just give me a ballpark. How many books are there in the JTS library?
Rounding, including all materials, about 400,000.
400,000. Good amount.
It's
a good amount for a library. Good amount for a library.